The sun was setting over the quiet streets of Pine Grove, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences. Agent Taylor Washington, one of the CIA's most respected operatives, gripped his steering wheel a little tighter as he drove his standard-issue black sedan through this small southern town. His dark suit was still crisp despite the long day, but exhaustion tugged at the corners of his eyes. He'd just wrapped up a sensitive domestic intelligence operation, the kind that kept Americans safe in their beds at night, though they'd never know about it. 15 years in the field had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him to stay alert despite his fatigue. The town seemed frozen in time, with its mom and pop stores and retro diners that looked like they hadn't changed since the 1950s. Taylor allowed himself a small smile, thinking about the hot shower and warm bed waiting for him back at headquarters. His mind drifted to the successful mission he'd just completed, one that would help prevent a major cybersecurity threat to the nation's infrastructure. The radio hummed softly in the background, playing an old jazz tune that reminded him of his grandfather's record collection. Taylor checked his watch. Another 2 hours of driving and he'd be home free. He'd done this drive countless times before, always blending in, just another businessman heading home after a long day's work. Little did he know that this peaceful evening drive was about to turn into one of the most challenging situations of his career. Not from international spies or cybercriminals, but from a threat much closer to home, a threat wearing badges and carrying prejudices as dangerous as any weapon. In his rearview mirror, Taylor noticed a police cruiser that had been following him for the past few minutes. He mentally reviewed his driving. Perfect speed, proper signaling, everything by the book. But years of experience had taught him that sometimes doing everything right wasn't enough. Not when the color of your skin made some people see you as suspicious by default. He straightened his tie and adjusted his posture, falling back on his CIA training. Stay calm, stay professional, control the situation. These were the mantras that had kept him alive in some of the world's most dangerous places. But somehow, this quiet street in small-town America felt just as threatening as any foreign battlefield. The cruiser's lights suddenly flashed to life, painting the inside of his car in alternating red and blue. Taylor took a deep breath, his mind already racing through protocols and procedures. As a deep-cover CIA agent, he carried multiple forms of identification, each with varying levels of classification. Using the wrong one could compromise national security, but using none could lead to an even more dangerous situation. He pulled over smoothly, positioning his car perfectly by the curb. Through his side mirror, he could see 2 officers emerging from their vehicle, their hands already resting on their equipment belts. Taylor's training kicked in automatically. Observe, analyze, adapt. Officer Reynolds and Officer Brooks, according to their name tags, both moved with the cocky confidence of men used to having their authority unquestioned. Taylor's fingers drummed once on the steering wheel, a habit he picked up during long stakeouts. He knew what was coming. He'd seen it before, heard about it from friends and family, read about it in reports that crossed his desk at Langley. But this time was different. This time, he was about to become another statistic in a long line of discriminatory traffic stops. As the officers approached his car, Taylor's mind wasn't on the classified documents safely locked in his trunk or the secure phone containing sensitive contact information. Instead, he thought about his father's words from long ago. "Son, sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with fists or guns, but with patience and dignity." The tap on his window was harder than necessary, an immediate power play. Taylor kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, his face a mask of polite inquiry. He'd stared down armed militants in war zones, but somehow this moment felt more precarious. Because here, in the gathering dusk of a small southern town, he wasn't CIA Agent Washington with 15 years of distinguished service. He was just another black man about to learn how quickly a routine traffic stop could go wrong. What happened next would not only test his training and patience, but would ultimately expose a deep-rooted problem in law enforcement that no badge or security clearance could protect against. As he rolled down his window, Taylor had no way of knowing that this encounter would soon explode into a national scandal that would change lives and challenge the very foundations of justice in America. The red and blue lights painted ghostly shadows on the dashboard as Agent Washington handed over his standard driver's license. He'd chosen not to use his federal credentials yet. Years of experience had taught him to play situations like this close to the chest. Officer Reynolds snatched the license with barely concealed disdain, while Officer Brooks circled the car, flashlight beam dancing across the windows. "You know why we pulled you over?" Reynolds asked, his tone suggesting he'd already made up his mind about the man behind the wheel. "No, sir, I don't," Washington replied evenly, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. His CIA training helped him notice every detail. Reynolds' finger tapping impatiently on his belt, Brooks' deliberate footsteps as he completed his circle of the car. "You were swerving back there," Reynolds said, though both men knew it was a lie. "Been drinking tonight?" "No, sir. I don't drink," Washington responded, maintaining his professional demeanor. He could feel his phone buzzing in his pocket, probably his handler wondering why he hadn't checked in yet. But reaching for it now would be a mistake. Brooks appeared at the driver's side window, his flashlight beam intentionally angled to shine in Washington's eyes. "This is a nice car for someone just passing through," he commented, his words dripping with suspicion. "What brings you to our town?" "Business trip. Heading back home now," Washington answered, keeping his responses short and clear. In his mind, he was calculating risks and scenarios just as he'd done in countless operations over cities. But this was different. This was home soil, where his badge and credentials should have meant something. "Step out of the vehicle," Reynolds ordered suddenly, hand resting on his holster. It wasn't a request. Washington complied slowly, methodically, remembering his father's wisdom about moments like these. As he stood, his suit jacket, worth more than these officers probably made in a week, did nothing to shield him from their prejudiced gaze. "I'm going to search your car," Brooks announced, already moving toward the trunk. "Got anything in there you want to tell us about?" "I do not consent to a search," Washington stated firmly but politely. "There's no probable cause, and I know my rights." The officers exchanged looks, the kind that spoke volumes about their intentions. Reynolds stepped closer, invading Washington's personal space. "We've got probable cause. I can smell something suspicious. And folks who know their rights too well? They're usually hiding something." Washington felt his jaw tighten but kept his expression neutral. He'd faced down armed militants in Damascus with less tension than he felt on this quiet suburban street. Through the corner of his eye, he could see Brooks already pulling on gloves, preparing to search the vehicle despite his explicit refusal. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to place your hands behind your back," Reynolds said, pulling out his handcuffs. "For our safety, you understand." The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Washington's wrists as Reynolds secured them, slightly tighter than necessary. His mind raced through options. Revealing his CIA status could compromise national security, but staying silent might lead somewhere even more dangerous. He watched helplessly as Brooks began rifling through his car, tossing aside his carefully organized documents, pawing through his suit jacket in the back seat. Washington's training screamed at him that something was wrong. The officer's body language, their coordinated movements, the way they seemed to be building toward something. Then he saw it, so quick he might have missed it if he hadn't been trained to notice such details. Brooks palmed something from his pocket before reaching into the car's trunk, making a show of discovering whatever he'd just planted. Well, what do we have here?" Brooks called out, his voice carrying artificial surprise. He emerged holding a small package that Washington knew with absolute certainty hadn't been there before. Reynolds' grip on Washington's arm tightened. "Looks like we've got ourselves a big fish, partner. You're in serious trouble now, boy." Washington remained silent, his mind already shifting from immediate survival to long-term strategy. He'd need to remember every detail of this encounter, every word, every action, every microsecond of illegal procedure. His CIA training had taught him that sometimes the best defense was to let your opponents think they'd won. As they roughly guided him toward the patrol car, Washington caught his reflection in the window, a successful federal agent reduced to a stereotype in seconds. But behind his calm exterior, his mind was already formulating a plan. These officers had no idea who they were dealing with, and more importantly, they had no idea about the storm they had just created. The patrol car's back door opened with a creak, and as Washington was pushed inside, he allowed himself a small, hidden smile. These officers thought they were following their usual playbook, but they just made the biggest mistake of their careers. They had no idea that this routine traffic stop was about to become the catalyst for their downfall and a nationwide reckoning with justice itself. The holding cell's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Agent Washington sat perfectly still on the metal bench, his mind working through the events of the last few hours like a chess master analyzing the board. The cell smelled of cheap disinfectant and stale coffee from the nearby break room. He could hear Officers Reynolds and Brooks laughing and chatting just around the corner, probably congratulating themselves on their big drug bust. "Paperwork's almost done," Reynolds called out to someone. "Got ourselves a real dealer this time. Found enough evidence to put him away for a long time." Washington's lips twitched slightly. In their arrogance, they hadn't even bothered to properly search him for additional phones or devices. His secure CIA-issued phone, hidden in a specially designed pocket, was still with him. Though powered down to prevent tracking, its mere presence was a lifeline he knew would soon come into play. The public defender they'd assigned him walked in, looking tired and overworked. She adjusted her glasses and introduced herself as Ms. Phillips. "They're charging you with possession with intent to distribute," she said, flipping through his file. "The evidence they found in your car was planted," Washington finished calmly. "And I can prove it." Phillips looked up, surprised by his confident tone. Most of her clients showed fear or anger, but this man radiated a quiet certainty that made her pause. "That's a serious accusation," she said, lowering her voice. "These officers have been on the force for 15 years. And I've been serving this country for just as long," Washington replied softly. "But right now, I need you to listen carefully. Things are about to get very interesting, and I need a lawyer who's ready for what's coming." Phillips studied him more closely now, noting his expensive suit, his perfect posture, the intelligent assessment in his eyes. This was not her usual client. "I'm listening," she said, pulling out a notebook. "First," Washington began, "I need you to look into traffic camera footage from Pine Street between 7:15 and 7:45 p.m. Second, I need you to file a motion to preserve all body camera footage from both officers. And third," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I need you to be prepared for some very high-level government officials to get involved in this case." Meanwhile, across town, things were already in motion. At a secure facility, a CIA monitoring station had registered an anomaly. One of their top agents had missed 2 mandatory check-ins. The agent's handler, Deputy Director Thompson, stared at the blinking red light on his screen with growing concern. "Run it again," he ordered the tech analyst beside him. "Every traffic camera, every surveillance feed. Find out what happened to our man." Back at the police station, Officers Reynolds and Brooks were finishing their paperwork, crafting their story with practiced ease. They'd done this dozens of times before. A routine traffic stop, suspicious behavior, probable cause, a search revealing drugs. Simple, clean, and by their crooked books, foolproof. "This one's going to look good on the monthly report," Brooks chuckled, typing up his version of events. Captain's been pushing for more drug busts. But they'd made a crucial mistake. In their haste to frame another innocent man, they'd failed to notice the high-end watch on Washington's wrist, standard CIA equipment with a built-in emergency beacon. Even now, its signal was bouncing off satellites, alerting the highest levels of government to a situation in progress. In her office, Phillips was already discovering discrepancies. The timing in the police report didn't match. The supposed probable cause was flimsy at best. And something about her client's demeanor kept nagging at her. This man wasn't worried about going to jail. He was waiting for something. Washington closed his eyes in the cell, appearing to doze but actually counting down in his head. His training had taught him patience, and right now, patience was his greatest weapon. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but the wheels of national security, those could move at lightning speed when necessary. The night shift was changing over when the first sign appeared. A simple phone call to the station chief. Then another. And another. Suddenly, the casual atmosphere of the small-town police station began to shift. Something was happening, though Reynolds and Brooks, still congratulating themselves on their clever frame-up, hadn't noticed yet. Washington opened his eyes as footsteps approached his cell. He could tell by the rhythm and weight that these weren't the familiar steps of Reynolds or Brooks. These were different, purposeful, authoritative. A small smile crossed his face as he heard multiple voices in the hallway, followed by the sound of official credentials being presented. The storm he'd known was coming was about to break, and when it did, it would wash away more than just a false drug charge. It would expose a system of corruption that had persisted for far too long. Reynolds and Brooks had no idea that by choosing him as their target, they just triggered an avalanche that would bury their badges, their careers, and their entire corrupt operation. As Washington stood up, straightening his tie, he thought again of his father's words about patience and dignity. Sometimes justice needed a little help to find its way. And sometimes the best way to fight corruption wasn't with fists or angry words, but with the full weight of truth and law coming down like a hammer of God. Deputy Director Thompson stood before a wall of monitors in the CIA's Domestic Operations Center, his face illuminated by the glow of surveillance footage playing across multiple screens. Dozens of analysts worked frantically at their stations, piecing together the events that had led to one of their top agents being held in a small-town jail cell. "Got something, sir," called out a young analyst, her fingers flying across her keyboard. Traffic cameras picked up the entire stop, running it through enhancement now. The footage played across the main screen, crystal clear despite the evening darkness. They watched as the police cruiser followed Washington's car for several minutes before initiating the stop. Thompson's eyes narrowed as he watched the officer's behavior unfold. "Run background on these officers," he ordered, pointing to Reynolds and Brooks. "Everything. Traffic stops, complaints, financial records. I want to know what they had for breakfast 10 years ago." Meanwhile, at the police station, Ms. Phillips was building her own case. She'd spent hours reviewing similar arrests by Reynolds and Brooks, and a disturbing pattern was emerging. The public defender's office hadn't noticed it before because the cases were spread out, but when laid side by side, the truth was undeniable. "Look at this," she muttered to herself, spreading files across her desk. "Same approach, same probable cause claims, same evidence amounts. It's like they're following a script." Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Check the traffic camera at Pine and Oak. Framed." Phillips stared at her phone, then quickly pulled up the footage. What she saw made her jaw drop. The camera had captured Brooks clearly placing something in Washington's trunk, while Reynolds kept him distracted. It was the smoking gun she needed. Back in the holding cell, Washington sat calmly, though his acute hearing picked up the increasing chaos in the station. More phones were ringing. People were speaking in hushed, urgent tones. The usual swagger in the officers' voices had been replaced by nervous energy. "Chief wants to see us," he heard Brooks tell Reynolds, their footsteps quick and anxious. Something about federal investigators asking questions. Washington allowed himself a small smile. The machinery of justice was grinding into motion, slow but unstoppable. He knew that right now, in offices across Washington, D.C., people were making calls, pulling files, and connecting dots that would soon form a noose around these corrupt officers' necks. In the police chief's office, reality was starting to dawn. Chief Porter, a veteran of 30 years on the force, stared at his computer screen in growing horror. Federal agencies were requesting files, demanding body camera footage, and asking pointed questions about his office's arrest records. "What did you two do?" he demanded as Reynolds and Brooks stood before his desk. "Half the alphabet agencies in D.C. are breathing down my neck over this arrest. Who is this guy?" Neither officer could answer. Their usual confidence had evaporated in the face of unprecedented scrutiny. The chief's phone rang again, this time from the mayor's office. The situation was escalating far beyond their control. Ms. Phillips walked briskly through the station, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. She carried a thick folder of evidence, but more importantly, she carried the truth. Behind her walked two federal agents, their presence causing heads to turn and conversations to halt. "I need to see my client," she announced to the desk sergeant, her voice carrying newfound authority. "And I need officers Reynolds and Brooks present for this conversation." The investigation was spreading like wildfire. Reporters had begun gathering outside the station, tipped off about a possible major civil rights violation. Other officers in the department started coming forward, sharing stories of misconduct they'd witnessed but been afraid to report. In Washington, D.C., Deputy Director Thompson prepared to board a helicopter. He'd just finished briefing his superiors about the situation. The decision had been made. It was time to reveal exactly who these small-town officers had tried to frame. "Sir," an aide called out as Thompson headed for the helipad, "we found more. Bank records show unusual deposits in both officers' accounts. They've been doing this for years." Thompson nodded grimly. "Send everything to the FBI's Civil Rights Division and get me the U.S. Attorney on the phone. This just became a federal case." Back in the holding cell, Washington heard the station's atmosphere shift again. Heavy doors opening, authoritative voices, the shuffle of May feet. He stood up, straightened his tie, and prepared himself. The next few moments would change not just his situation, but potentially the entire landscape of law enforcement in this small town. Through the cell door, he could see Reynolds and Brooks being led to an interview room, their faces pale with the realization that their routine frame-up had somehow spawned a federal investigation. They had no idea that their world was about to collapse completely, that their years of corrupt practices were about to be exposed on a national stage. The cell door opened, and Ms. Phillips stood there with a triumphant smile, flanked by federal agents. "Mr. Washington," she said, "I believe it's time we showed these officers exactly who they're dealing with." The police station's conference room had been transformed into a command center. Maps, photographs, and timeline charts covered the walls as Ms. Phillips and the federal investigators prepared their case. The air crackled with purpose and anticipation. "Look at this pattern," Phillips said, pointing to a series of arrest records. "Every month, like clockwork. They target drivers passing through town, always with the same story. Routine traffic stop turns into a drug bust. The evidence amounts are nearly identical each time." Deputy Director Thompson studied the documents spread across the table, and the bank records. Deposits of exactly $5,000 appear in their accounts 3 days after each arrest, an FBI analyst reported. Always in cash, always the same amount. They got lazy, thought nobody would notice. Outside the conference room, the station buzzed with activity. Other officers walked past, stealing glances through the windows. Word had spread quickly. Reynolds and Brooks, once considered untouchable, were now the subjects of a federal investigation. In a separate room, Washington sat with his handler, reviewing their strategy for the upcoming court appearance. "The CIA director has authorized a partial disclosure of your status," the handler explained. "Enough to establish your credibility without compromising national security." Washington nodded, his mind already several steps ahead. "The traffic camera footage. Enhanced and authenticated by our tech team. It clearly shows Officer Brooks planting evidence. We've also recovered their dash cam footage. They forgot to delete it." Meanwhile, Reynolds and Brooks sat in separate holding cells, their world crumbling around them. Through the walls, Reynolds could hear Brooks being interviewed by federal agents, his voice rising in panic as he realized the depth of trouble they were in. "We've got to stick to our story," Reynolds muttered to himself, but doubt crept into his voice. He hadn't expected this level of scrutiny. None of their previous targets had ever fought back with such overwhelming force. In the station's break room, veteran officers gathered, speaking in hushed tones about the investigation. "I always knew those two were dirty," one whispered. "Remember that stop last summer? The one that didn't add up?" "Yeah, but who was going to speak up?" They had protection from somewhere high up. That protection was now evaporating. In City Hall, the mayor sat with the police chief, both men looking shell-shocked as they reviewed the evidence collected against Reynolds and Brooks. "This goes deeper than just two corrupt officers," the chief admitted, his face ashen. "Their arrest records, the missing evidence from old cases, the connection to that judge who always signed their warrants. It's a whole network." Back in the conference room, Phillips received a call that made her smile. The state police just found a storage unit rented under Brooks's wife's name. It's full of evidence from old cases, things that were supposed to be destroyed years ago. Thompson's phone buzzed with a message from Washington, D.C. The CIA director will be here tomorrow morning. He's bringing documentation of Agent Washington's service record, 15 years of exemplary operations, countless lives saved, national security threats neutralized. The pieces were falling into place. Phillips organized her notes for court, each page representing another nail in the corrupt officer's coffin. The evidence was overwhelming. bank records, video footage, witness statements from other officers, and a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. We're not just exposing two corrupt cops, she realized, speaking to Thompson. We're uncovering a whole system of injustice. This case could change everything. Washington stood by the window, watching the sun set over the small town. Tomorrow, in court, the truth would finally come out. Not just about his innocence, but about years of systematic abuse of power that had destroyed countless lives. Your father would be proud, Thompson said quietly, standing beside him. This is bigger than just clearing your name. This could spark real change. In their cells, Reynolds and Brooks had no idea that their routine traffic stop had just triggered the collapse of their entire corrupt operation. They didn't know about the federal agents interviewing their old arrests, about the evidence being uncovered, about the other officers coming forward with stories of misconduct. The night grew deeper, but the station remained alive with activity. Phones rang, printers hummed, and investigators pieced together years of corruption. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation in court, but tonight was about preparation, about building an ironclad case that would expose the truth. Ms. Phillips made one final check of her files before heading home. The traffic camera footage was secured, witness statements collected, financial records documented. Everything was ready. Tomorrow, justice would have its day in court, and two corrupt officers would learn the hard way that they'd picked the wrong man to frame. The courthouse buzzed with tension on the morning of the hearing. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Inside, the old wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators, reporters, and off-duty police officers who'd come to witness what promised to be an explosive revelation. Agent Washington sat at the defense table, perfectly composed in a fresh suit. Ms. Phillips arranged her documents with careful precision, each piece of evidence ready to be unveiled at exactly the right moment. The prosecution table, usually a place of confidence, held two nervous-looking district attorneys who'd just learned the true nature of their case. Officer Reynolds and Brooks entered in handcuffs, their pressed uniforms doing little to hide their unease. Their usual swagger had vanished, replaced by darting glances and nervous fidgeting. They'd refused to take any plea deals, still believing their word as officers would outweigh any evidence against them. All rise, the bailiff called out as Judge Anderson entered the courtroom. The judge, known for his no-nonsense approach, surveyed the packed room with sharp eyes. He'd been briefed about the unusual nature of this case, though even he didn't know everything that was about to unfold. The prosecuting attorney stood first, presenting the original charges against Washington. His voice lacked conviction as he recited the official complaint. The state charges the defendant with possession of controlled substances with intent to distribute, based on evidence discovered during a routine traffic stop. Ms. Phillips rose slowly, her confidence filling the courtroom. Your Honor, the defense moves to dismiss all charges, and we're prepared to present evidence of serious misconduct by the arresting officers. The judge nodded, and Phillips began her systematic dismantling of the officer's case. First came the traffic camera footage, played on large screens for the entire courtroom to see. The gallery murmured as they watched Officer Brooks clearly planting evidence in Washington's car. Furthermore, Phillips continued, we have documentation of a pattern of similar false arrests spanning the past 5 years. She presented chart after chart, showing the identical nature of dozens of arrests, the suspicious timing of cash deposits, the missing evidence from the property room. Reynolds and Brooks shifted uncomfortably in their seats as their careers unraveled before their eyes. Their own body camera footage betrayed them, showing contradictions in their stories, revealing coded phrases they used to coordinate their frame-ups. Then came the parade of witnesses. Other officers from the department stepped forward, finally free to speak about the corruption they'd witnessed. Former victims of the officers' schemes told their stories, their voices shaking with emotion as they described how false charges had derailed their lives. The judge's expression grew darker with each revelation, but the biggest shock was yet to come. Your Honor, Phillips announced, I called Deputy Director Thompson of the Central Intelligence Agency to the stand. A ripple of surprise ran through the courtroom as Thompson strode forward. He cut an impressive figure in his government suit, his authority evident in every step. After being sworn in, he turned to face the courtroom. Agent Washington, he began, is one of our most decorated operatives. On the night in question, he was returning from a mission crucial to national security. These officers didn't just frame an innocent man, they interfered with a federal operation. The color drained from Reynolds and Brooks' faces as they realized the true magnitude of their mistake. Their lawyer frantically scribbled notes, but there was no legal strategy that could save them now. Thompson continued, detailing Washington's 15 years of service while carefully avoiding classified details. He explained the significance of the mission that had brought Washington through their jurisdiction, painting a picture of a dedicated agent whose work had saved countless American lives. The judge interrupted only once to ask Washington directly, "Why didn't you identify yourself as a federal agent during the arrest?" Washington stood, his voice steady. "Your Honor, my mission classification level meant I couldn't disclose my identity without proper authorization. These officers didn't just violate my civil rights, they compromised operational security by detaining me without cause." The final blow came when Phillips presented the financial evidence. Bank records showed a complex web of payments flowing through shell companies, linking the officers to a larger network of corruption. Their scheme hadn't just trapped innocent travelers, it had been funding a criminal enterprise operating under the cover of law enforcement. As the evidence mounted, the prosecuting attorneys quietly approached the bench. They could no longer ethically pursue charges against Washington. Instead, they requested an immediate dismissal and announced their intention to file charges against Reynolds and Brooks. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder in the stunned courtroom. "Case dismissed," he announced, then turned his stern gaze to the officers. "Officers Reynolds and Brooks, you are hereby remanded into federal custody pending charges of civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and conspiracy." As federal marshals led the former officers away, Washington stood quietly beside Phillips. Their victory wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about exposing a system of corruption that had preyed on innocent people for years. The small-town courtroom had become ground zero for a change that would ripple through law enforcement agencies across the country. 3 months after the explosive courtroom revelation, Agent Washington stood at his office window in CIA headquarters, watching the sun rise over the nation's capital. On his desk sat the morning's newspaper, its headline bold and clear, "Former officers plead guilty in corruption case. Reform bill passes state legislature." The story had exploded across national media, sparking a conversation about police accountability that couldn't be ignored. What started as a routine traffic stop in a small town has snowballed into a movement for change that was sweeping across the country. His phone buzzed, a message from Ms. Phillips. She'd become something of a civil rights champion since the case, taking on similar cases across the state. "Thought you'd want to know," her message read. 3 more officers from neighboring counties just came forward about similar schemes. "This is bigger than we imagined." Washington smiled, remembering his father's words about patience and dignity. The old man had passed away years ago, but his wisdom had guided Washington through that crucial night. Now that wisdom was helping to reshape law enforcement across the nation. In the small town where it all began, changes were already visible. The new police chief, a reform-minded veteran from the state police, had implemented mandatory body cameras, enhanced oversight, and community engagement programs. The old guard who'd protected Reynolds and Brooks had been replaced by officers committed to honest service. "Sir," his assistant called from the doorway. "The director wants to see you." In the director's office, Washington found not just his boss, but Deputy Director Thompson and several high-ranking Justice Department officials. On the conference table lay a thick folder marked Police Reform Initiative. "Your case has opened doors we've been trying to unlock for years," the director began. "We need someone who understands both sides, law enforcement and the community. Someone who can help guide these reforms while maintaining national security priorities." Washington studied the folder. "You're creating a new division." "Joint Task Force," Thompson explained. "CIA, FBI, and Justice Department working together to identify and eliminate corruption in law enforcement while protecting civil rights. We want you to head it." Meanwhile, in a federal courthouse across town, Reynolds and Brooks faced their final sentencing. Their plea deal had required them to expose their entire network. The judges who rubber-stamped their warrants, the evidence clerks who looked the other way, the senior officers who helped cover their tracks. The investigation had spread like wildfire. Similar schemes were being uncovered in other jurisdictions. Officers who'd once felt untouchable were now facing justice. More importantly, victims of false arrests were having their cases reviewed, their records cleared, their lives restored. Back at headquarters, Washington reviewed the files of other agents who'd faced similar discrimination. His case had opened the door for them to come forward, to share their stories without fear of compromising their positions or national security. His phone buzzed again, this time a message from an unknown number. "Thank you," it read. "My brother was one of their victims. He's being released next week. You changed everything." Messages like this had been pouring in since the story broke. Each one reminded Washington that sometimes the most important victories weren't won in foreign operations or covert missions, but in standing up for what's right at home. The police reform bill that passed in the wake of his case had teeth: mandatory body cameras with strict retention policies, independent oversight committees, new training programs focused on community relations and bias recognition, real change written into law. In the small town's police station, a framed news article hung in the lobby. It served as both a warning and a promise, a reminder that no badge placed anyone above the law and that true justice required constant vigilance. Washington's new task force office was taking shape. Maps covered the walls, tracking similar cases across the country. His team included civil rights attorneys, former officers committed to reform, and intelligence analysts skilled at spotting patterns of corruption. "We've got another one," an analyst called out, pointing to a cluster of data points on the map. Same pattern, routine stops, planted evidence, missing property room records. Washington nodded, already planning the investigation. His experience had taught him that sunlight was the best disinfectant, and he was about to throw open all the windows. The day ended with a community meeting in the town where it all began. Local residents, police officers, and city officials gathered to discuss the changes, the challenges, and the path forward. Washington sat quietly in the back, watching democracy in action. A young officer approached him after the meeting. "I joined the force to help people," she said. "What you did, it gave us a chance to restore trust, to do this job the right way." As Washington drove home that evening, he passed the spot where he'd been pulled over all those months ago. The street looked the same, but everything else had changed. One man's stand for justice had triggered a wave of reform that would protect countless others from similar abuse. His father's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with fists or guns, but with patience and dignity. Those words had guided him through that crucial night, and now they were helping to guide an entire movement for change. The sun set over the capital city, casting long shadows across the streets. But unlike that night months ago, these shadows didn't hide corruption and injustice. Instead, they marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a new era of accountability, reform, and hope for a better tomorrow.